So, creationism is a radical ideology. The arguments that people are going to make are that, well, every single culture on the face of the earth has some creation story. And what we mean by creationism is the idea that people are separate from nature, that people have been specially created by God and in the image of God or the gods. So pretty much every culture on the face of the planet historically has had some version of this creation myth. And therefore people would argue, well, this isn't radical at all. This is traditional, this is ubiquitous, this is everywhere. This is possibly the least radical thing that we could believe in. What's radical is Darwinism and evolution and all these crazy ideas. But I would argue that just because something is ubiquitous does not make it less radical. Language is radical. In evolutionary terms, the ability that humans have for language is radical. It allows us to create mimetic structures that evolve over time culturally, mythic structures that allow for us to think rationally. That is radical. That's a radical departure from the rest of the animal kingdom. So this is what I mean when I say creationism is radical. And maybe the term ideology isn't, people could quibble over that. What exactly is what's the boundary between ideology, myth, religion, these different mimetic structures? It is a mimetic structure. It's a radical mimetic structure. And it could be universal for one of two reasons. It could be universal because there was a group of creationists who were so influential that they traveled around the world and taught everybody creationism. That's one explanation. And that in many cases is the creationist explanation, that the reason why, for example, I'll give a parallel example of the flood myth. The reason why the flood myth is everywhere is either because, well, it just happened everywhere and so everyone has that reporting, or because people went around and taught about a flood myth. So there's different ways of explaining why it's ubiquitous. Another explanation is that a creationist, well, there's two sub-explanations, but the main one is success. And so the first one could be that creationism as a mimetic structure is so powerful that all human groups converge on creationism because it's simply the natural, successful strategy. It's a way of thinking about our origins that allows us to outcompete everybody else. And so it's like the Triceratops and the rhinoceros, they converge on pretty much the same form, even though one is from a rat, one is from a lizard. They pretty much converge on the same form. So you have a convergent evolution argument for why we have the ubiquitousness of creationism, although maybe someone's going to come up with a human group that doesn't have a creationist mythos, but most do. The other argument is that creationism in itself is not a useful mimetic structure, which I don't believe this to be the case, but I'll just argue it anyway, or just lay it out. You could argue that creationism is not useful, but it is the natural conclusion of other useful faculties. And so the fact that we're rational, we're able to project into the past, present, future, we are able to ask the question of where do we come from. It's impossible to ask that question without arriving at something that looks like creationism. Now, what is the default hypothesis, or I guess you could say the pre-hypothesis, even though hypothesis, hypothesis, below the thesis, that which stands below, that which is before, the studying and the observing and the empiricism. But how would a human animal, rather than a rational human, what would an animal, if an animal could think, or if we tried to remove the rational part of the mind and we just tried to conceive of what would a pre-creationist idea look like, if such a thing is possible. I don't know that it is. And we're going to get to the post-creationist as well, the Darwinist, so don't worry about that. But the pre-creationist would say something like it's turtles all the way down. Because if you ask the human animal, whatever that looks like, you say, where do you come from? Well, if they don't tell you, oh, well, we come from God. God created us. We were created from mud. God shaped us in the image of God or gods. If they don't say that, they're going to say, well, I come from my mom and dad. They say, well, where do your mom and dad come from? Well, they come from their mom and dad. Well, where do they come from? mom and dad, the grandfather and the great-grandfather, and so on and so forth. So we come from our ancestors. Where do your ancestors come from? They come from their ancestors. And it just becomes a turtles all the way down. And it's this infinite regression that if you are a rational thinker and you're thinking into the past and you're thinking, well, you're starting to make, I guess, these kind of early theological arguments. It's like, what do you mean we were just always around? Because you can see that things change, right? We know that things change over time. This is sort of an evolutionary perspective now. But the idea that we just had eternal ancestors, does that entirely make sense? At some point, doesn't this have to have a beginning, a middle, and an end? Doesn't there have to be some kind of pre-human state and origin to humans? What would that look like? So there's a lot of, that's opening up a huge discussion of like the origins of creationism and where this comes from. But that's just to lay out a little bit of it. And so then we look at the post-creationists, the Darwinists. And a lot of people have argued that Darwinism is a kind of nominalism because it relies on this concept of random mutation, and thus it's absurd and it's nihilistic, and it says that we're not special, we weren't made in the image of God, therefore we're worthless. But actually, another interpretation is that Darwinism is Nietzschean, in that Darwinism implies, even as we talk about Darwinism being opposed to Lamarckianism, there is something in the knowledge, right? When animals go through a Darwinian process, they do so unconsciously. But the idea of Darwinism, not the process of Darwinism, but the idea of Darwinism implies that now that we have knowledge of our evolution, we can control and direct it in a conscious way. And so what's happened is you've replaced the creationist God, the God who creates men out of bark or mud or something like that. And now, instead of a God somewhere outside of us, somewhere else, creating us, it's we who are creating ourselves. Remember, this is distinct from the pre-creationist notion of infinite regression to the ancestors and the ancestor cult, because now there's a clear beginning, middle, end. There's an origin to life. It progresses, it evolves. Now we're here, and now we're conscious of our evolution, and now we can become transhuman, and now we can go beyond the human, and that's Nietzsche's idea. So post-creationism is not the same as pre-creationism, and actually has more in common with creationism than with pre-creationism, meaning that to the pre-creationists, the infinite regression to the ancestors implies being rather than becoming, just like we are, we is, we been, we will be, and there's really no change going on. We're just continuing the traditions of the ancestors. We were always here, we always will be here. Creationism implies there's a definitive point prior to humanity, and now we're made in the image of God. Now we're special and we're separate from nature, and that's radical. That's a deep left idea. And then you've got this post-creationism and Darwinism that, yes, I think some of the random mutation or some of the absurd nominalist stuff, the arbitrary nature of it, I think you could try to make some argument that that's a return to being rather than becoming. But usually what happens is that form of nihilism gets addressed by people like Nietzsche, and even by Schopenhauer, talks about the will and the concept of Lamarckianism. And you start to get in this concept of, okay, well, if the world is absurd, but we're rational, like the world out there is absurd, but we in here, we're rational. We have telos, we have purpose, we can create meaning, even if there's no objective sense. At least we can create a subjective sense of meaning. And so we can grab things by the reins, and we can become the gods, and we can create ourselves, create our future, and design ourselves how we want to be. That transhumanism results from creationism. Transhumanism is not completely divorced from, distinct from, or opposite to creationism, but it's an extension of creationism. It's creationism taken to the nth degree, to the next level. Now, to the creationist says, oh, I'm traditional, I've always been around, but that's not true. This is a unique product of mimetic structures only humans have. Animals don't have creationism. They have, if anything, if they have any kind of sense of where they come from, which they probably don't, but if they do, it would just be an infinite regression to the ancestors, which I believe was the pre-creationist structure, if anything existed. If you asked some kind of person living in a pre-creationist period, if such a thing existed. Again, there's a lot of hypothesizing here, origins of language, origins of myth. We don't know exactly these things because we don't have the evidence, we don't have the records, it's all speculative. But my speculation is that this was a revolutionary thing. It came at a period of other revolutions, linguistic revolutions, technological revolutions, the revolution of agriculture, revolutions of religion, revolutions of the state, revolutions of global travel. People think that global travel has only been around for about 200 years. People have been traveling across the world for tens of thousands of years, slowly, but they have been traveling. If you walk a mile every day, and there's 365 days in a year, then, you know, every 10 years, that's 3,000 miles. Every 100 years, that's 30,000 miles. So within a couple of generations, you can travel the entire planet, okay? And it's not just one group doing that, but it's multiple groups. So let's say a group in South America travels to North America in 30 years. Those groups in North America travel across the Bering Strait to Asia in 30 years, or back and forth. Let's say a group travels from Asia to North America. A separate group B travels up to North America from South America. So groups A and B, previously in Asia and South America, now meet in North America and create a third culture C, all within the span of 30 years in one lifetime. So people don't think that happened, but it did. There were hunter-gatherers. Not every human group did that, but certain human groups, such as those who left Africa, were very expansionary, were very interested in nomadism and traveling. And so the internet is not an invention ex nihilo, but it's an expression of a deep human need for this type of change and exploration. Sometimes people call it Faustian or deep left or whatever. But this desire has always been around. It's just we haven't always developed the technology to bring it to the extent we have today with the internet. Now, this Faustianism has become so uncontrolled, some people call it Prometheanism, that it actually becomes self-destructive because we can't handle the change that we ourselves have created. Just like creationism was around for a while, it is radical, but we managed to integrate it using religious structures. Then Darwinism comes around 200 years ago, and it's so radical and the implications are so earth-shattering that in many cases we can't handle it, and this results in nihilism. Now, I would argue that this isn't simply an emergent random phenomenon of us accidentally stumbling upon mimetic structures that are sort of cancerous, poisonous, and self-destructive. But actually, I think the people at the top recognize this, because if I can understand this, anybody can understand this. And the people who make decisions, people who have money, understand this. And therefore, they are deliberately choosing not to solve the problem. I think the problem could be solved or at least addressed more than it is, but it's not. So that's the video for today. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.